Welcome, everyone, to another session of Wellness Wednesdays. If you're just joining us for the first time, my name is Christy Nielsen, and I work for Healthy Campus, and I serve as the Assistant Director for Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Initiatives. Wellness Wednesdays is a series that we started back in April of 2020, specifically in light of COVID 19 and trying to provide short, bite sized wellness episodes for individuals, specifically related to their experience during COVID 19. So, things to help them with quarantine, isolation, anxiety around the future, and topics to that degree. Now the program has evolved where we talk about wellness information that can be applied to COVID, but it's become broader than that. And so hopefully the wellness information that you learn during this series can be applicable not only to what we're doing and what we're experiencing right now during the pandemic, but also can be applied to future seasons of life. So I would encourage you to go to this website. This is our Healthy Campus Wellness Wednesdays website. You can take a picture of this URL and go to it later, but this website is where all of our previous episodes are held. So originally we had done Wellness Wednesdays in a live format, but now we're delivering episodes asynchronously about twice a month. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about Suicide Prevention Month. So September is Suicide Prevention Month. And so this is our agenda for today. So we're going to talk about bringing awareness to suicide and the need for prevention. So, why do we need to do those things? Why do we even need Suicide Prevention Month? Is this a widespread public health issue regarding suicide? And so we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about what exactly is Suicide Prevention Month. So, what is that? What does that entail? And then thirdly, we're going to go over how you can support your family, friends, students, the community, and yourself. So, first, we're going to go over the need for Suicide Prevention Month. So, I'm just going to share some data points around this topic. So, when it comes to suicides in the United States, if you look at the most recent data from the CDC, which was in 2018, and we look at the fatalities that happened in the country in that year, about 20% of all fatalities in the United States were by suicide. And so that number boils down to about 48,344 individuals. And if anyone who's listening to this has taken the Tigers Together advocacy training that we offer here at Clemson, you learn in that training that one of the facts around suicide is that it can be prevented. And so if we're thinking about that, and then we hold that also in with this idea that 48,000 people in 2018 died by suicide, that's a lot of preventable deaths. And so that's one reason why Suicide Prevention Month exists, is because we want to bring awareness to this public health crisis, and we also want to bring hope to those that are struggling or to those that have lost somebody to suicide, that there are things there are things that can help, and there are resources for those who are hurting maybe from a suicide loss. And so there are resources out there as well, and there's so much that we can do prevention wide to decrease this number. We also know from a recent poll some data around the public's perception around mental health and suicide prevention. Specifically, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the Education Development Center, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention commissioned the Harris Poll to conduct a nationally representative sample of U.S. adults in order to do a couple different things. But the one that we're going to focus on is that they asked the Harris Poll to do a survey to assess the public's knowledge about suicide and mental health and the role they may play in being there for someone who is struggling or is in crisis. Um, and another thing this poll did was that it assessed how people were doing in their mental health, it's specific in light of COVID-19. But I think it grabbed a good pulse of how people are doing in general in the United States. And so we know from this recent poll that about 1 in 4 U.S. adults said they had personally thought about or attempted suicide. And so if we think about how large of a nation the United States is, and then thinking about a quarter of that population population seriously consider not being here tomorrow, that is a public health crisis. And that is, I think, by itself, that's a good enough reason to have Suicide Prevention Month, because we know people are struggling to the point of, I just don't want to be here anymore. So we want to, there's a lot that goes into that, but one thing is teaching coping mechanisms of, hey, there are ways that, it's not going to be easy, but there are things that we can all do to help ourselves feel better and to really help our neighbors feel better as well. And then bringing it down to South Carolina specifically, I know this is a pretty busy slide, but if we just focus on a couple different things, one is that we know that suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in South Carolina. So the good news is that it's not among the top 10 leading causes of death, but it's still pretty high up there for our state. We also know that our suicide rate compared to the nation's is higher. Out of 100,000 people, about 15.47 die of suicide in South Carolina, compared to the 14.21 rate of our nation. So that's also disturbing too, to know that we're higher than average. We also know, if we're thinking about kind of what does this look like day to day for our state, about one person every 11 hours dies by suicide. So about two people every day die by suicide in our state, which is far too many individuals who are losing their life to suicide. And then lastly, if we look at the leading causes of death for certain age groups, we look at the age range of 10 to 24. And the reason we're doing that is because we all know, working at Clemson, whether you work directly with students or indirectly, all of our goals working at Clemson is ultimately to help students get a good education, so that they can thrive, get an education, and then move on and get a good job. And so if we're looking at the traditional college age range, college student age range from 18 to 22, or maybe even 24, 25 if they're getting a grad degree. We know that suicide is the third leading cause of death for this age group, which is very disturbing. And so we know that this is a public health crisis, not just for the nation, for our state, but then also for the age group that we all work with in our state. And then going back to the poll that we just talked about a second ago, it also kind of, was assessing what would people do, what kind of suicide prevention tactics would people implement if they thought somebody was struggling, whether it was a loved one or just somebody that they saw just walking around. And so we have some good news and bad news. So first, we'll start with the good news. When they asked people if they felt suicide was preventable, about 93% of people agree that they thought that suicide is preventable at least sometimes. And that's really good news for us, because we know that sometimes people think, well, if somebody is suicidal, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, they're just going to go carry it out. Like, there's nothing I can do. But we know that that's actually not true, that there are many things that can be done to help somebody not die by suicide. A big one is, means limiting access to lethal means. And so if you can put time and space between somebody who is suicidal and the means that they want to use to die, then that can save a life. And so we know that it is preventable. And the good news is that most of America believes that suicide can be preventable at least sometimes. So that's good news. We also know that almost 80% of people said they would be interested in learning how to play a role in helping somebody who may be suicidal. So again, that's really good news for us, because most people are wanting to be what we call advocates. They're wanting to advocate on behalf of those who are struggling and want to help. So that's really good, and I think that's a testament to the fact that suicide, the stigma around it has gone down a lot. Same with mental health. I think the stigma is still there, but I think that it has decreased over the years, which is a really good thing. And then lastly, we know that about 3/4 of people said they're comfortable being there for a loved one who might be struggling. So again, just people are wanting to be advocates, which is great. So we have some bad news though. One thing is that the poll showed that about 1 in 3 people feel they can tell when somebody is suicidal. So that means that two-thirds of everybody in our nation doesn't feel like they can tell when somebody is struggling with suicidal thoughts. They don't think they can identify warning signs for suicide. So that can be concerning, because going back to the Tigers Together advocacy training that I mentioned a second ago, in that training, we talk about certain facts around suicide, and so one of the facts is that we know that most people do show warning signs for suicide, and so that given that, knowing that, and then also from this poll, we can see that most people don't even think they can recognize warning signs for suicide. That's an issue. And then about 6 in 10 people said that they feel like there are certain barriers to helping somebody who has suicidal thoughts, and so some barriers that are reported is that about a third of people said they fear they would make the person feel worse. About almost a quarter of people, 24%, said they worry talking about suicide would increase the likelihood of somebody dying by suicide. And then lastly, about 22% said they would not know what to say or do if somebody told them they were having thoughts of suicide. So, this is the bad news that we're finding from this poll, but this is why Suicide Prevention Month is needed, because Suicide Prevention Month and the all of the the educational opportunities that come about, through it, through different organizations, and a lot of the things that are posted on social media, all the resources, these are all supposed to help with some of the gaps that we see in terms of people's advocacy for suicide prevention. And so for example, 1 in 3 people feel they can tell when somebody is suicidal. Okay, so if we have a gap in not knowing the warning signs, there's a chunk of Suicide Prevention Month that is dedicated to teaching people what are the warning signs for suicide, how can you recognize them. And then the same thing with the second statistic about over half of people said there are barriers to helping somebody. For example, they fear they would make the person feel worse. Where again, there's a whole part of Suicide Prevention Month, especially through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, that has resource after resource after resource of helping people learn how to best navigate a conversation around suicide if they're worried that their friend or their family member is suicidal, how to have a conversation. And kind of for that specifically, ultimately it boils down to, it's not going to be a perfect conversation. It's okay if it feels really awkward. The most important thing is that you just ask them about suicide. And so there's so many resources that are available that come about through Suicide Prevention Month, but they're available all year, that are directed towards these gaps in advocacy that we see in our nation. And so these are just some of the reasons why we need Suicide Prevention Month, because it really highlights this public health crisis. But then the hope is that it would not just stay within the month of September, but that it would expand throughout the entire year as well, and sharing resources, advocating on behalf of those who are struggling, advocating in a political realm at the local, state, or national level. So we'll get into some of those action items in a second, but this is just kind of the foundation for why we need Suicide Prevention Month. So when is Suicide Prevention Month? So like we've talked about, it's in September, so it's going on right now in September 2020. And then there's a couple things that happen. It's not just it's not just that it's the whole month, but then there are specific times throughout the month that are that have particular action items that go on. So World Suicide Prevention Day is September 10th, and so that's actually that's on a Thursday this year, and so September 10th. And then Suicide Prevention Week is the week that surrounds World Suicide Prevention Day, and so it's for this year is the September 7th through the 13th is what we categorize as Suicide Prevention Week. So different organizations do different things in terms of how they recognize Suicide Prevention Month, and so some just have events throughout the whole month. Some just have it for that week, and then some have things that go on specifically on September 10th. And so you'll see the graphics to the right. Those all come from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and they relate to the various parts of the month. And they do different events on depending on what time of the month it is. Okay, so what is Suicide Prevention Month? So what do we do to actually recognize this month? So again, various organizations do different things. They have different emphasis. And so, there's so many different organizations that bring awareness to this, which is a really good thing. But some of the, kind of the more well-known names are the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and then the National Action Alliance. And then there's also the Suicide Prevention Lifeline organization. They all have different emphases, but there are general themes that they hit on. So I'll just name a few here. There's a very heavy emphasis on community. And what I mean by that is that whenever we're talking about Suicide Prevention Month, we are really focusing on not only can you help yourself and help yourself feel better and know the resources for yourself, but we're really focused on what can you do to help your neighbor, what can you do to help your community around you. If there's somebody who's struggling, if it's a family member, a friend, a student, a coworker, whoever it may be, if there's somebody around you who's struggling, what can you do to help that person? And so there's a really heavy emphasis on taking care of one another. Kind of along with that is, being able to recognize what are the warning signs for suicide. So there are some organizations that really specifically focus on educating the public. These are the things to look out for. This is how you have a conversation, and that's kind of leading into the next one. So how do you actually talk to somebody about suicide? The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has a lot of great information on this, and that I'll share with you in a little bit. But how do you actually navigate that conversation? Resources for others and yourself. So, mental health related resources, suicide prevention related resources. Um, Other themes that organizations focus on is advocacy. So, in kind of the political sense. So, how do you advocate for suicide prevention policies and legislation? And I believe it's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that does their day on Capitol Hill every year, where they lobby for certain mental health legislation. Usually, it's to do with healthcare. Um, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is a big advocate of this next one, is to share with others about your mental health journey. So if you have struggled with a mental health condition, or you know somebody who has struggled with a mental health condition, and then that's impacted you. Maybe you grew up with somebody in your household who had one, or something along those lines, and really sharing your story around that. What was it like to be, to live with somebody who struggled consistently with anxiety, or what was it like for you to grow up dealing with an eating disorder, or various stories. There's so many out there, and I think this is a really cool way to get involved in Suicide Prevention Month, because we know that stories have power, right? If you go to a conference and you go to like the keynote speaker's presentation, you're not going to remember all of the data and the graphs and all of that kind of boring stuff that people share. You're going to remember the stories that they tell, the stories that really grip the human heart. And so, the stories have so much power. And so we really want to kind of tap into that power here during Suicide Prevention Month, and talking about how people have overcome, and how people may be still struggling but are managing that struggle, and that can provide a lot of hope to those who are in kind of a darker place with their mental health. And then all of this, goes with destigmatizing suicide and mental health. I mean, that's the whole point of the month, and that's hopefully extends past September to the whole year. Is we really want to bring these things out of the darkness and into the light, because when people start to feel comfortable talking about these things, then that's that'll expedite their healing process. Because the sooner they talk about it, the sooner they get help, and then the sooner they start to get better. So the whole point is destigmatizing suicide and mental health. All right. So, what can you do to take care, to advocate for Suicide Prevention Month? What can you do to get involved? So, these are some. These are definitely. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some kind of, I guess, areas that you can get involved in for Suicide Prevention Month. And each of these areas, I've actually created a resource sheet that has multiple links under each of these topic areas, and you can actually find that resource sheet on the Wellness Wednesday website. So it should be right next to where you see this video is the resource sheet. But I'll just kind of review these on a bird's eye view. So the first is caring. So taking care of your own mental well-being. So if you've been in the mental health world at all, you might have heard this analogy, the idea of self care being really important, but the analogy being that when you're on an airplane and they always tell you if the oxygen gets depleted in in the airplane, then the masks will fall down, the oxygen mask will fall down, and you need to put your mask on before you help your child. And the reason is because if you focus so much on getting your child set up, you might then lose the oxygen and pass out, and you might not get enough oxygen and then pass out. So you're not able to help your child then because you pass out, and then you obviously can't help yourself. And so it's the same kind of applies for the mental health field. Is that you can't help other people effectively. You still can help obviously, but you can't help to I guess like your most efficient state if you're not also taking care of your own mental health. So there's no kind of perfection. You have to be perfect in order to help other people. By no means that's not true. But just that the sense of if we're not taking care of ourselves and our mental health, then we can't effectively take care of others. And so I've listed again on that resource sheet multiple links that you can go to check out how can I actually um, to take care of my mental well-being and my mental health. And the cool thing about mental health and health in general is that it's so comprehensive and intertwined. So there's so many different things that you can do to mind and to take care of your own mental health. Physical activity, eating well, getting enough sleep. What can you do in your social circles that affects your mental health? So making sure you get human contact, things like that. And we've touched on some of those, more holistic aspects of health and previous Wellness Wednesdays episodes. So I encourage you to go look at those. The second is to initiate. So initiate conversations with that loved one that you're concerned about. So I think life is hard enough in general, but then now with the pandemic that's been happening, just thinking about who is that person in your life that you're worried about. Maybe you haven't thought about them in a while, or maybe they're on your mind every day. But who is that person that is maybe lonely or lives alone, or has a pre-existing physical condition that makes it a little bit more risky for them to go out during COVID. That they're in a higher risk group, and they're worried about COVID and things like that. So, who are those individuals that you're concerned about? And then just initiate a conversation with them. It doesn't have to go to the place of asking about suicide. I mean, it could, but just initiating a conversation to ask them, how are you doing really? Not just, hey, how are you doing? Good. How are you? Good. But really actually getting deeper to say, hey, I know that you have all these hard things going on in your life. How are you actually doing with that? How are you handling it? And then, and one way that can really help with that conversation is that you yourself are also vulnerable to say, you don't want to dominate the conversation, but you could just say, I've been having a really tough time, or this is how I've been processing things, because that can help the other person feel comfortable. So, yeah, just initiate a conversation. Thirdly, is educating yourself. So, educate yourself around mental health, educate yourself around suicide prevention. Chances are you know somebody who has a mental health condition and or who has thought about suicide, or maybe even attempted. And so it's just important that we are educated on what is it that our neighbors could be struggling with, or that we ourselves could be struggling with that we might not know. um, Fourthly is to share resources and information with other people. So again, on that resource sheet that I created, there's a couple different links to so many resources out there that great organizations have created. And then we also have some resources specific to Clemson that I've put on there as well. And then lastly is advocate. So again, advocating at the local, state, and national levels. And it doesn't have to be as big as traveling to Capitol Hill and lobbying. It could even just be, signing up. I think it's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have a listserv, I think, that you can join. And then they'll create basically these letters, these templates for you to send to your local congressman to say, hey, can you please advocate on behalf of this mental health legislation for me, because this is what I believe is really important for our nation. And I mean, it's really easy to, all you have to do is plug in your name, and you can do a little personal note if you want to. But then, they American Foundation for Suicide Prevention basically does the rest. So, yeah, just advocate. So one last thing before we close is that if we want to get really practical to how can we get involved in Suicide Prevention Month, and then we think specifically at Clemson. I've mentioned this a few times, but Clemson through my department, Healthy Campus, we actually offer Tigers Together advocacy training. So this is a training that I facilitate to our campus community, and so the point of the training is that it will prepare you to be a bridge between somebody who's at risk for suicide and then the mental health professional help that they may need. So it's not training folks to be counselors or therapists or anything like that, but really to be able to recognize warning signs for suicide. How do we start and have a conversation around suicide if we're worried about a student? And then how do we connect them to resources? And so really the goal of this training is to focus on students who are at risk for suicide, but really a lot of the information you can apply to if you're worried about a fellow staff or faculty member, if you're worried about a family member or a friend, you can apply these basic these same principles to those situations as well. So there's a couple different ways to get this advocacy training. The first is that you could attend September 10th's training. We're doing a Tigers Together on World Suicide Prevention Day, so you can contact me for more information. The second is that you can request a departmental level training. If you or a coworker cannot make it on September 10th, then you can actually go to that website, clemson.edu/suicide prevention, and click on the Tigers Together advocacy training button on the right hand side, and that will lead you to a form that you fill out in order to request the training, and then I work with you all to figure out what works best for your schedule. And then the last option is that you can review the recorded version of Tigers Together on Tiger Training. And so we're going to be recording September 10th's training, and then it'll be uploaded to Tiger Training within the week following. So if you are interested in learning the information but just don't have time to learn it through the other options, then you can always just look at the recorded version as well. So that is Suicide Prevention Month in a nutshell. This is my contact information. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to shoot me an email. But I thank you all for your time, and I hope that you get involved in Suicide Prevention Month, and I hope you have a great week.